Tilly August pulled the car up to the gate and pressed the remote. She waited, finger hovering to press it again, when finally the gate shuddered and slowly swung open, the sound echoing faintly in the quiet. Beside her, Anne glanced at the rusty hinges with a faint sigh. The iron gate groaned as it swung wider, its hinges shrieking faintly into the still afternoon. Tilly August's hands rested on the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on the rusty chain pulley. She waited, her finger hovering over the remote as if pressing it again might make the gate move faster. Beside her, Anne Auguste sighed softly and adjusted the hem of her brown sweater. The soft knit draped smoothly over her beige trousers, pressed with a precise crease. Her low-heeled loafers, polished to a faint shine, caught the dim light filtering through the trees. At 58, Anne's slender frame stood slightly taller than Tilly's, her posture straight and deliberate. Her blonde hair, tied back into a neat ponytail that hung just past her shoulders, revealed no trace of grey, though the even tone of the dye softened its vibrancy. The crisp cream collar of her blouse added a clean line against her neck, framing her face. Her green eyes, bright and flecked with blue, flicked toward the gate as she reached down and shifted the strap of her leather satchel with a smooth, practiced motion. Tilly wore a similar outfit. Her chunky brown sweater was thick and less fitted, its loose knit slightly rumpled at the cuffs. Her oatmeal trousers, less structured than her mother's, hung loosely around her hips, with the hems lightly brushing the tops of her boots. Though shorter by an inch, Tilly's frame was curvier than her mother's, with a softer silhouette. She often downplayed through the way she dressed. Her medium brown hair, secured in a ponytail, fell slightly longer than Anne's, brushing the middle of her back. Her green-blue eyes mirrored Anne's, though set against softer, rounder features. "It probably hasn't been opened in years," Anne murmured, as the gate creaked wider, allowing just enough space for the car to pass through. "We're lucky it moved at all." Tilly steered carefully up the cobblestone drive. The stones were uneven under the tires, worn smooth in some places, cracked and missing in others. Overgrown branches cast flickering shadows across the windshield, their leaves brushing faintly against the sides of the car. The drive opened into a clearing, revealing the house at its center. August House rose before them, a towering structure of faded red brick. Vines climbed the walls, their tendrils weaving around dark wooden window frames. Several panes were clouded with grime. One bore a faint crack that traced across its surface like a delicate web. The wide front porch was framed by thick stone columns, their bases softened by moss creeping along the edges. "It's bigger than I remembered," Tilly murmured, as the car rolled to a stop. Anne stepped out first, brushing a stray leaf from her sleeve. Her gaze moved over the warped shingles and weathered door, her expression unreadable. Tilly followed, retrieving their bags from the trunk. The iron railing felt cool and solid under her hand as she climbed the stone steps, the grooves beneath her feet worn by decades of passing footsteps. The front door loomed large, its thick wood carved with details of ivy and flowers. An iron knocker shaped like a hollow-eyed face hung in the center, its surface marked by the elements. Tilly pushed the door open, stepping into the house's cool, dim interior. The air carried a faint scent of lavender over a sharper undercurrent of aged wood and dust. The entryway stretched wide, the wooden floor creaking slightly under her boots as she moved. Her gaze was drawn upward to the grand staircase curving toward the second floor, its banisters smooth with age. She paused, letting the atmosphere settle around her. Sunlight filtered in through narrow windows, casting hazy beams across the walls where faded wallpaper clung stubbornly to the plaster. She could still see faint traces of intricate patterns in the paper, though time had worn its vibrancy down to pale, ghostly shapes. Anne lingered near the threshold, her arms loosely crossed as she surveyed the room. "It's been sitting too long," she said, her voice measured. "The wood will have warped. I wouldn't trust the plumbing either." Tilly didn't reply. Instead, she wandered into the parlour off to the left. Heavy curtains covered the windows, their thick fabric still managing to block most of the light. She reached up to tug one aside, and sunlight spilled in, revealing a chandelier coated in dust. The crystals caught the light faintly, a muted echo of the grandeur they must have once displayed. Furniture was shrouded in sheets, their pale forms ghostly in the dimness. Tilly ran her fingers over the edge of a covered armchair, feeling the faint texture of the fabric beneath. Her hand brushed a brass knob on the side door, which led down a narrow hall to the kitchen. The space felt smaller than she remembered, though in truth it hadn't changed. The counters were worn, the sink stained with the faint memory of rust. Tilly twisted the faucet, and the water sputtered to life, running brown for a moment before clearing. She stared at it, letting the sound fill the space. "I like the smell of old wood," she murmured, mostly to herself. Anne's voice came from the hallway. "Well, I don't. And this place is full of it." Tilly shut off the water and moved back toward the entryway. She turned toward the gallery, pushing open a door to the right. The air here was warmer, heavier, carrying a peculiar stillness that pressed softly against her senses. Light filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting golden bars across the floor. Paintings lined the walls, their frames pressed tightly together so that no bare plaster showed between them. Fairies filled the canvases, delicate figures with translucent wings, their expressions sharp and watchful. Some hovered in mid-air, their poses dynamic, while others crouched in shadow, their eyes half-lidded. Tilly paused before one painting, her gaze caught by the almost lifelike texture of a fairy's gossamer wings. At the far end of the gallery, a long table displayed sculptures of various sizes. She was drawn to a bronze figure poised mid-dance, balanced impossibly on a single pointed toe. The details were exquisite, the faint veins in its wings, the ripple of its gown. Another sculpture depicted a crouching figure with angular wings folded tightly to its back. Its face seemed to shift in the dim light, as though it might turn toward her at any moment. Her steps faltered as she approached the centerpiece of the room, a painting larger than the rest, its frame intricately carved with ivy and flowers. The canvas depicted a moonlit garden with a fountain at its heart. Water shimmered under starlight, its ripples caught mid-motion, as though stirred by an invisible hand. Fairies gathered at the fountain's edge, their faces tilted upward, their expressions reverent. Tilly's breath slowed as she studied the painting. She had been here before, she was certain of it, though the memory felt hazy. A faint image came to her, standing on tiptoe to see over a table, her chin barely clearing the edge as she stared at a bronze fairy in mid-leap. Fred's voice had come from behind her, calm and serious. "If you spend too much time with fairies," he had said, "they may just steal you away. The fairies are always stealing little things, and you're a little thing." She had laughed nervously then, her hand inching toward the sculpture even as Fred took her by the arm and led her out of the room. The memory carried a weight she hadn't understood at the time, and now it settled in her chest, heavy and uneasy. Anne's voice broke through her thoughts. "What are you doing in here?" Tilly turned, her hand dropping from the edge of the painting's frame. Anne stood in the doorway, her gaze sharp, but not unkind. "You've been gone so long I thought you fell down a rabbit hole." "Just looking." Tilly replied, her voice faint. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to sound more present. "Oh. Did Fred ever tell you about this room?" Anne stepped inside, her eyes moving over the paintings, the sculptures, the intricate carvings filling every corner. "I don't think I've ever been in here," she admitted, her tone measured. Fred liked his secrets. Tilly nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the fountain painting for a moment longer before she stepped away. She continued her exploration, wandering into the dining room with its long table and dust-covered chairs. A tarnished chandelier hung above, its crystals casting faint rainbows in the dim light. Beyond the dining room was a small sitting room, its walls lined with shelves stacked haphazardly with books and knickknacks. Tilly traced the spines of the books, her fingers brushing over faded titles. Upstairs, she passed through bedrooms layered with decades of forgotten belongings. Boxes crowded the corners, furniture stood draped in sheets, and faded posters clung stubbornly to peeling walls. Anne's old room was the most intact, its echo and the Bunnymen posters still clinging to the walls amidst the clutter. Tilly paused, running her fingers along the edge of a desk where Anne might have sat years ago, penning letters or sketching dreams long since abandoned. Back downstairs, Anne stood near the door, arms crossed. "You've seen enough for today. Let's get something to eat." Tilly nodded, though her gaze drifted toward the light spilling through the hedged path leading to the garden. "You go ahead," she said. "I'll meet you at the car in 20 minutes. Anne hesitated, but then nodded, stepping outside. The door swung shut, leaving Tilly alone in the house. She turned toward the garden, drawn by the faint memory of Fred's voice and the pull of something she couldn't name. Tilly stepped through the hedge's narrow opening, brushing aside a few straggling branches. The cool air beneath the canopy greeted her, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and greenery. The garden seemed quieter than the house, yet alive in its own way. Leaves shifted softly in the breeze that barely stirred her hair, and the rustle of unseen insects mingled with the faint creak of branches overhead. Her steps slowed as she took in the overgrowth. Wild violets clustering at the base of a tree, their deep purple a vivid contrast against the pale bark, and ferns sprawling over the edges of a crumbling stone path. Ahead, the narrow path widened into a clearing. Tilly stopped, her breath catching as the fountain came into view. Even beneath a tangle of vines and creeping moss, its presence commanded the space. The base of the fountain was cracked in places, the stone darkened and uneven where weather and time had left their marks. Yet the statue above was untouched, its pale stone gleaming faintly as sunlight filtered through the canopy. The fairy's wings stretched high, each line carved with such precision that they seemed ready to tremble with a breath of wind. The folds of the figure's robe captured a sense of motion, as though it had been caught mid-flight, its serene face tilted upward in quiet anticipation. Tilly stepped closer, brushing a stray leaf off her sleeve. Her gaze lingered on the statue's expression, the details so lifelike they felt almost intrusive to look at for too long. Without thinking, she tugged off her sweater, draping it over the edge of the fountain's basin as her focus stayed on the figure above. Beneath her sweater, the fabric of her long-sleeved shirt clung lightly to her wrists, cool against her skin. Her fingers trailed along the stone lip of the fountain. The surface was rough and irregular, softened in places where moss had claimed its ground. She leaned forward, peering into the basin, where a few tarnished coins glinted beneath a thin layer of green residue. Dry leaves clung stubbornly to the edges, and faint cracks spread across the basin's floor, radiating outward like veins on an ancient map. For a moment, the sunlight above the statue bent strangely. As though it formed the shape of an offering, the fairy's hand seemed to hold. She stepped back, her gaze travelling over the statue again. It was almost unnerving how well preserved it was, as though the elements had conspired to leave it untouched while everything else decayed. The pristine stone caught the light differently here, its surface glowing faintly against the tangled wildness of the clearing. The garden felt larger as she lingered near the fountain, the overgrowth receding just enough to hint at its former design. The dense hedges beyond the clearing framed the space like an ancient archway, their branches bending inward, letting the sunlight fall in pale streaks. For a brief moment, the thought crossed her mind that she wasn't entirely alone. A rustling sound reached her ears, a faint, fleeting motion at the edge of her vision. But when she turned, nothing stirred among the shadows. A distant chime interrupted her thoughts, faint and high-pitched, like the edge of a bell's ring. It tugged at a memory buried deep in her mind. Uncle Fred's voice echoed softly. "Fairies are always stealing little things. Be careful, you're a little thing yourself." Tilly took a small step back from the fountain, rubbing her arms absently. The clearing seemed to hold its breath, the hedges beyond forming a barrier that felt both enclosing and protective. Her gaze lingered on the statue one last time, the outstretched hand still waiting. There was something quietly commanding about the way it stood, its wings reaching higher than seemed possible. Her chest tightened as she turned toward the path. She moved back through the archway, the hedge brushing lightly against her shoulders. The shadows clung closer around her now, the garden's paths narrowing as though urging her back to the house. As she stepped into the sunlight near the driveway, the sweater she'd left behind flickered briefly in her thoughts, but just as quickly, the thought slipped away, lost in the transition back to the ordinary light of day. I hope you've enjoyed this first chapter of John Hewitt's novel, August House. To be notified when new chapters appear, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. In the next chapter, our hero Tilly will find herself pulled deeper into the mysteries of August House and its liminal garden. We'll also learn more about the magical city of Santa Creda. Until then, thank you for listening all the way through. Goodbye for now.